The accusation. The automatic doors of Summit Styles slid open with a quiet whoosh as Marcus Taylor stepped inside, the cool air conditioning washing over him. He paused for a moment, taking in the sleek, modern interior of the high-end fashion boutique. Rows of gleaming shelves displayed the latest sneakers, handbags, and apparel from top brands, the kind of merchandise that made people stop and stare. For months, Marcus had been saving up for this day. 16, tall and lean, with dark brown skin and sharp eyes filled with quiet determination, he had spent every weekend mowing lawns, walking dogs, and helping neighbors with odd jobs. Every dollar had gone straight into a jar labeled Dream Kicks. Now, after months of work, he finally had enough to buy the Adidas Ultrax Prime, the latest and sleekest basketball sneakers that had been dominating his dreams. The store wasn't too crowded, just a few customers browsing, a couple whispering near the glass display cases, and a cashier who barely looked up from behind the counter. But Marcus felt the eyes on him the moment he stepped inside. Behind the main register stood Diane Caldwell, the store manager, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp, calculating eyes and a stiff posture. Diane had worked in retail long enough to believe she had developed a sixth sense about troublemakers. And to her, Marcus fit the description. He didn't know it yet, but from the second he walked in, Diane had already made up her mind. Another teenager, another potential thief. She had seen it before, young boys wandering in with their hands in their pockets, pretending to browse but really waiting for a chance to slip something into their jackets. She had personally stopped 3 incidents in the past month alone, and she was convinced that today would be number 4. A shopping trip turned sour. Marcus made his way toward the back wall, his gaze landing on the glass case where the Adidas Ultrax Prime sat under the LED lights, glowing like a trophy. He let out a slow breath. This was it. His hands ran lightly over the display case as he scanned the price tag, $250. It was a lot of money, but he had earned every penny, and he was ready to buy. But as he reached for the buzzer to request an employee's assistance, a sharp, unfriendly voice cut through the air. "Can I help you with something?" Marcus turned, surprised by the hostility in the tone. Diane Caldwell stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, watching him like he had already done something wrong. Her eyes flicked down to his hoodie, then to his slightly worn sneakers, then back up to his face. Marcus straightened. "Yeah, actually. I was hoping to buy the Ultrax Prime in size 11. Diane didn't move. "Are you sure about that?" Marcus blinked. Yeah. "Do you even know how much those cost?" Diane asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. The question hit him like a slap. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I do." Diane didn't seem convinced. He had seen this before, the way some adults looked at him when he walked into expensive stores, the way their eyes lingered just a little longer, like they were waiting for him to slip up. But he wasn't here to argue. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "I have the money right here." But Diane's gaze didn't leave his face. "I need you to empty your pockets." The accusation. The store fell silent. Marcus stiffened, barely processing what he had just heard. "Excuse me." Diane took a step closer. "You heard me. Empty your pockets." A woman near the handbag section turned her head slightly, eyebrows raised. A man in a crisp business suit near the register shifted uncomfortably. Even the young cashier, a girl no older than 21, looked uneasy but said nothing. Marcus clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and it probably wouldn't be the last. "Why?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "You think I stole something?" Diane didn't hesitate. "I just need to check." Marcus let out a slow, disbelieving chuckle. "You ask everybody to empty their pockets, or just the black kids?" A few customers stiffened, clearly sensing the tension, but no one spoke. Diane's lips thinned. "It's just store policy." Marcus' patience wore thinner by the second. Funny. I don't see you checking anyone else. Diane crossed her arms, unwavering. If you haven't taken anything, then it shouldn't be a problem. Marcus could feel his hands shaking, not from fear, but from sheer frustration. He could feel the weight of the stares, the unspoken judgment from some, and the silent support from others. He could already predict what would happen if he reacted the way she wanted him to. If he got angry, if he raised his voice. So he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly. He pulled out his phone, his keys, and his folded stack of hard-earned cash. He placed them on the counter with a quiet thud. There, Diane glanced down at the items, her expression unreadable. There was nothing else. Still, she didn't back down. Turn them inside out. A murmur rippled through the store. Even the cashier's face paled slightly. Marcus exhaled sharply, his patience hanging by a thread. Are you serious? Diane didn't flinch. Either you do it, or I call security. And there it was. The threat. Marcus took another deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't about to give her the reaction she wanted. Instead, he picked up his phone, unlocked it with a swipe, and tapped a number. Then he raised it to his ear. Diane frowned. What are you doing? Marcus didn't look away. Mom, can you come inside? His voice was calm, even, but there was something in it, something firm. And then, through the heavy silence of the store, came the unmistakable sound of heels clicking against the pavement outside. Then, the soft chime of the boutique's glass door swinging open. And the moment Vanessa Taylor walked in, the entire energy of the store shifted. Diane still didn't know who she was. Not yet. She still thought she was in control. But in just a few seconds, her entire world was about to flip upside down. The power shift. The moment Vanessa Taylor stepped through the doors of Summit Styles, the temperature in the store seemed to shift. There was no dramatic announcement, no raised voice, no storming in with fury. Instead, she entered with a kind of calm authority that made people straighten their backs before they even realized why. She moved with precision, each step deliberate, her heels clicking against the polished tile floor like the ticking of a countdown clock. Diane Caldwell barely spared her a glance at first. She was still focused on Marcus, her eyes narrowed with a sense of self-righteous victory. To her, this was just another case of a teenager trying to act tough, calling in a parent to bail him out of trouble. She had seen it before, mothers coming in with weak excuses, fathers raising their voices, only to be shut down when she stood her ground. She was ready for this fight, or so she thought. Marcus turned slightly as his mother approached, the relief in his shoulders subtle but unmistakable. He didn't have to explain. She already knew. She had heard the edge in his voice over the phone, the restraint he had forced into every word. That alone told her everything she needed to know. Vanessa took in the scene before her, the scattered silence of the store, the tension in the air so thick it could have been cut with a knife, the way customers stood frozen in place, watching but pretending not to. The young cashier looking like she wanted to be anywhere but here. And Diane, arms crossed, chin lifted slightly, standing in the posture of someone who still believed she was in control. Vanessa didn't look at Diane right away. Instead, she turned to Marcus, her eyes scanning him like a mother checking for damage after a fight. Are you okay? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Marcus nodded. Yeah, I'm good. She gave him a long, searching look before finally shifting her gaze to Diane. The store manager, to her credit, held her ground, but there was the smallest flicker of hesitation in her eyes. It was the first crack in the wall of assured confidence she had built around herself. Vanessa could see it. Can I help you? Diane asked, her tone professional but cold. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into something that wasn't quite a smile. I should be asking you the same thing, she said smoothly. My son called me. Said he was accused of stealing. Diane straightened, regaining some of her earlier authority. We have protocols in place to prevent shoplifting, she replied crisply. Your son was acting suspiciously. I simply followed store policy." Vanessa exhaled slowly, her expression not changing, but something behind her eyes sharpening. "And what exactly did he do that was suspicious?" Diane's mouth opened, but for the first time, she hesitated. She hadn't expected to be questioned. Most people got defensive, angry, even belligerent. That was how these situations usually went. But Vanessa wasn't reacting. She was analyzing. "He was lingering," Diane finally said, though even she seemed to recognize how weak that sounded. "Checking prices, looking around a lot, and he had his hands in his pockets." Vanessa's eyebrows lifted, and a humorless chuckle escaped her lips. "He was shopping in a store, looking at the prices of items he intended to buy. And you decided that meant he was stealing." Diane's expression hardened. "We can't take risks. If I let things slide, we'll be out of business in a week." Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "So you assumed my son was a criminal?" Diane scoffed slightly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "That's not what I said." "But it's exactly what you meant." Vanessa's voice remained smooth, but now it carried something heavier, a steel edge that made the air in the store feel tighter. "You had no reason to suspect him, other than the fact that he fit your idea of a thief." Diane's jaw tensed. "I don't have to justify myself to you." Vanessa took a step closer, her presence towering in a way that had nothing to do with height. "Actually, you do," she said, "because what you just did to my son is the kind of discrimination that destroys lives. And you're standing here acting like it's just another day at work." A tense silence filled the store, stretching long enough that a few customers subtly edged away, pretending to browse but clearly listening. Marcus had seen his mother handle situations before. He knew she was smart, knew she was powerful in ways that had nothing to do with money. But seeing her now, completely dismantling Diane's false confidence, was something else entirely. Diane, however, wasn't giving up yet. "Look, if you want to file a complaint, you can contact corporate. But as far as I'm concerned, I was just doing my job." Vanessa smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the type of smile that made people nervous, the kind that told you things were about to get worse. "Oh, don't worry, I'll be speaking to corporate," she said. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. With a smooth motion, she flipped it open, revealing an embossed gold card. Diane barely glanced at it, until she saw the name. Her face drained of color so fast that Marcus thought she might actually faint. Vanessa Taylor, founder and CEO. For the first time since this confrontation started, Diane froze. Her eyes darted from the card to Vanessa's face, then back down as if she had misread. But the words didn't change. The reality didn't shift. Vanessa Taylor, the woman who owned Summit Styles, was standing right in front of her. Marcus watched as the gears turned behind Diane's panicked expression. He could almost hear her brain scrambling for an escape, but there wasn't one. Vanessa gave her a long, measured look. "How long have you worked here?" she asked, the question deceptively soft. Diane swallowed. 2 years. "And in those 2 years, how many customers have you stopped? How many people have you humiliated with accusations you couldn't prove?" Diane's throat bobbed. How many of them looked like my son?" Vanessa cut in, her voice a shade sharper. Diane had no answer, because there was no answer that wouldn't incriminate her. Vanessa tilted her head, as if considering her next words carefully. "You see, Diane, I built this company on a foundation of trust and respect. I hire people who understand that, people who treat customers with fairness, no matter what they look like." Diane opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Vanessa took a slow breath. "Unfortunately, you don't seem to be one of those people." Diane's entire face fell. "Do you wait? You're fired." The words were sharp, clean, final. A gasp rippled through the store. The young cashier at the register looked stunned. A man near the back let out a low whistle. A woman near the handbag section smirked. Diane took a stumbling step back. You can't just. I can, Vanessa said simply. And I just did. Diane's mouth opened and closed, her hands gripping the fabric of her shirt as though trying to hold on to something solid. But she was already sinking. Slowly, she grabbed her bag from behind the counter, her movements stiff and robotic. She hesitated one last time, her eyes darting around the store, searching for support. There was none. Without another word, she turned and walked out. The glass doors swished shut behind her, and for the first time in minutes, the store breathed again. Marcus exhaled. Well, that was dramatic. Vanessa turned to him, her expression softening slightly. You okay? He smirked. Yeah, I just wanted my shoes. Didn't expect a whole retail revolution. Vanessa chuckled. Well, let's get your shoes. And with that, they walked toward the register, heads held high. Lessons in power and perception. The store was quieter now, but the air still carried the weight of what had just happened. The tension had dissipated, but not completely. There was still a charge lingering, like the aftermath of a thunderstorm. The customers who had stood frozen moments ago were now pretending to go back to their shopping, but their eyes still flickered toward Marcus and Vanessa. Some whispered to one another in hushed tones, processing what they had just witnessed. Others gave subtle nods of approval, expressions betraying silent support. At the register, the young cashier, her name tag reading Lena, was still gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles slightly pale. Her wide eyes flicked between Marcus and Vanessa, then to the glass doors, where Diane had just stormed out in stunned humiliation. She seemed hesitant, as though unsure whether to proceed as usual or acknowledge what had just transpired. Vanessa, composed as ever, offered her a small, reassuring nod. Do you mind ringing up my son's shoes? Her voice was polite, even warm, as if she had not just fired the store's manager in front of half a dozen customers. Lena snapped back to attention. Oh, of course, she stammered, quickly stepping away from the register to retrieve Marcus' requested sneakers from the stockroom. Her movements were quick, almost hurried, as though afraid she might be reprimanded for making them wait too long. She disappeared behind the sleek glass doors marked Employees Only, leaving Marcus standing at the counter beside his mother. Marcus exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, finally allowing himself to relax. The frustration was still there, buried under his skin like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. But at least he knew it was over. At least Diane was gone. She really thought she was untouchable, Marcus muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Like no one could call her out on her mess. Vanessa hummed in agreement, tapping her manicured nails lightly against the countertop. That's the thing about people like her, she mused. They spend so much time getting away with things that they start believing they always will, and when consequences finally show up, they have no idea how to handle them. Marcus huffed. Yeah, she folded real quick the second she realized who you were. Vanessa turned slightly, giving him a knowing look. And what does that tell you? Marcus shrugged. That people like her only respect power. Vanessa's lips curved slightly, though there was something sad beneath the smile. Not just power, she corrected. They respect what they recognize as power. She glanced toward the door, her expression thoughtful. The truth is, if I were just another random customer, she wouldn't have backed down. She wouldn't have even thought about apologizing. Marcus frowned, his fingers drumming against the countertop. So, what then? If you weren't the owner, would she have just called security? Had me dragged out? Vanessa met his gaze, and for the first time that afternoon, hesitation flickered in her expression. She didn't want to say it, didn't want to confirm what Marcus already knew deep down, but she didn't lie. Not to him. She might have, she admitted, or maybe she would have let it go at just embarrassing you. But either way, she wouldn't have questioned herself, because to her, you weren't someone who deserved the benefit of the doubt. Marcus exhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. It wasn't new information. He had known it since he was young, Since the first time someone clutched their purse a little tighter when he walked by, or when a teacher watched him more closely than the other kids during a school fundraiser. But knowing it and having it spelled out in front of him in real time were two different things. He crossed his arms. So, what's the lesson here? That people like her only change when they get hit where it hurts. Vanessa studied him for a moment before shaking her head. No. The lesson is that you should never let people convince you to accept less respect than you deserve. She tapped the counter lightly. If you had let her treat you like a criminal, if you had just emptied your pockets and walked out without saying anything, she would have done it to the next kid. And the next. And the next. Marcus nodded slowly, her words sinking in. So standing up for myself wasn't just about me. Vanessa smiled. Proud. Exactly. Just then, Lena reappeared from the back room, holding a sleek black shoebox with Adidas Ultrax Prime printed across the top in bold silver lettering. She set it down carefully on the counter, still looking a little nervous as she glanced between Marcus and Vanessa. "I'm really sorry about what happened," Lena blurted out suddenly, her voice quiet but sincere. Marcus blinked, surprised by the guilt in her expression. She was young, barely in her 20s, and clearly rattled by what had just transpired. Vanessa tilted her head. "Why are you apologizing?" Lena hesitated, gripping the edges of the shoebox. "Because I saw it happening, and I didn't say anything," she admitted. "I should have. I mean, I wanted to, but..." She trailed off, looking ashamed. "I guess I was scared." Marcus exchanged a glance with his mother. He could tell Vanessa was watching Lena closely, gauging her, trying to decide if her regret was genuine or just an act to save face. Vanessa sighed after a moment, her expression softening just slightly. "It's not easy speaking up in situations like that," she acknowledged, "especially when you feel like your job is on the line." Lena nodded quickly. "Yeah. And Diane, she's always been like that. You weren't the first person she targeted, and you probably wouldn't have been the last." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "You mean she's done this before?" Lena bit her lip. "Not exactly like this, but yeah. I've seen her follow certain customers around the store, asking them unnecessary questions, giving them a hard time over small things. I think the only reason she never got called out before is because she knew how to toe the line just enough." Marcus scoffed. "So basically, she was just careful enough to get away with it." Lena nodded. "Yeah. Until today." A thoughtful silence settled between them. Then, Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something, Lena. Do you like working here?" Lena blinked, looking surprised by the question. "I mean, yeah, I do. Or at least I did before Diane started making things miserable. I don't know what's gonna happen now, though. She was technically my boss." Vanessa smirked. "Not anymore." Lena's eyes widened slightly. "Starting today," Vanessa continued, "we're going to be making some changes around here, and I need people who actually know how to treat customers with respect. So, how would you feel about a promotion?" Lena stared, looking as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "Wait, are you serious?" Vanessa nodded. "Consider it my first step in cleaning up the culture Diane left behind." Lena's mouth opened, then closed. Then opened again. I'd love that," she said quickly. "I mean, I'd be honored." Vanessa smiled. "Good. Then let's make sure this place actually lives up to the name Summit Styles. Because if there's one thing I won't tolerate, it's a store that makes people feel like they don't belong." Lena grinned. "Absolutely." Vanessa turned back to Marcus. "Now, are you ready to finally get your shoes?" Marcus chuckled, shaking his head as he grabbed the shoebox. "Man, I was just trying to buy sneakers," he muttered. "Didn't know I was walking into a corporate revolution." Vanessa smirked. "Sometimes standing your ground has a bigger impact than you think." And as they walked out, Marcus realized she was right. Aftermath and new beginnings. The walk to the car was quieter than usual. The sun hummed low in the sky, painting the pavement in streaks of gold and amber. The weight of what had just happened still clung to Marcus's shoulders, even though Diane was gone, even though he finally had his shoes. His mother walked beside him, composed as always, but he knew her well enough to recognize that her mind was still spinning. As soon as they reached the car, Marcus placed the shoebox gently in the back seat before leaning against the door with a deep sigh. He rubbed the back of his neck, processing everything. "That was something," he muttered, shaking his head. "I feel like I just lived through one of those viral videos." Vanessa chuckled softly, unlocking the car with a click. "It definitely had all the makings of one," she admitted. "But unlike those videos, there was no need for shouting. No need for a scene. Just facts." She glanced at him knowingly. Sometimes that's all it takes to dismantle ignorance. Just presenting the truth so clearly that the other person has no choice but to face it. Marcus scoffed, crossing his arms. "Yeah, well, I don't think Diane faced anything. She looked more like she was running from it." He shook his head, exhaling sharply. "You think she actually learned anything from this?" Vanessa studied him for a moment before sighing. "Maybe. But most likely, she's just bitter. People like her rarely see themselves as the problem. Instead, they convinced themselves that they were the victims." She reached for the car door handle, pausing. "But that's not the point, Marcus." He frowned. "Then what is?" "The point is that you didn't let her get away with it." She turned to face him fully, her expression softer now but still firm. "This was never about Diane learning anything. It was about making sure that her actions didn't go unchecked. You refused to let her decide who you were. You stood your ground, and because of that, other people saw what she really was." Marcus leaned against the car, his fingers tapping idly against the hood. "Yeah, I guess," he muttered. "Still doesn't feel like enough, though." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. "What would feel like enough?" Marcus hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe if I thought this would stop happening altogether. Like today it was me, but tomorrow it's going to be another kid, and they might not have someone to back them up like I did." He clenched his jaw. "That's the part that gets me." Vanessa's gaze softened. She understood exactly what he was feeling, because she had felt it too. Many times, the frustration of knowing that even when you win, the battle never really ends. The knowledge that, no matter how many people you hold accountable, the world doesn't change overnight. She exhaled slowly, stepping closer to him. "You're right," she said quietly. "There will be another kid, and another Diane. This isn't something that one conversation, or one confrontation, is going to fix." Marcus scoffed. "Then what's the point? If people like her are just gonna keep existing, then why even bother?" Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Because the world doesn't change all at once, Marcus. It changes one moment at a time." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "And today, you were that moment. Maybe someone in that store was watching. Maybe some other kid saw what happened and realized they don't have to just take it. Maybe even Lena learned something about speaking up when she sees something wrong." Marcus exhaled through his nose, letting her words settle. He wanted to believe that was true. That today had actually made a difference. Vanessa gave his shoulder a squeeze before stepping back and opening the car door. "Come on, let's go home." As they got into the car and pulled onto the road, Marcus stared out the window, his mind still turning over everything that had happened. He should have felt relieved. After all, Diane was gone. He had his sneakers, and his mom had put yet another ignorant person in their place. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't just want to be done with this moment. He wanted to do something more. Something that would last. A bigger conversation. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table eating dinner, Marcus finally voiced the thought that had been sitting in the back of his mind since they left the store. "So, what now?" he asked, setting his fork down. Vanessa looked up from her plate, eyebrow raised. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "I mean, this whole thing with Diane. It wasn't just about her. She's not the only person who thinks like that. So how do we stop more Dianes from happening? Vanessa smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. That's a big question, Marcus. But if you're asking how to make a bigger impact, then I'd say the first step is conversation. Marcus frowned. What, like just talking about it? Vanessa nodded. Exactly. Change doesn't start with policies or punishments. It starts with awareness. People need to see it, hear it, and understand why it's a problem before anything can shift. She took a sip of her tea before setting it down. And right now, you have the chance to be a voice in that conversation. Marcus considered that for a long moment. How? Vanessa studied him, as if deciding whether he was really ready to take on that kind of responsibility. Then, she grabbed her phone, swiped a few times, and turned the screen toward him. People are already talking about what happened today, she said. Marcus leaned in, eyes widening slightly as he saw that Summit Styles was already trending in local discussion forums. A few customers from the store had posted about the incident, some describing the confrontation in detail, others praising Vanessa for the way she handled it. Even Lena had commented, saying that seeing Marcus stand his ground had made her realize how important it was to speak up when something was wrong. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. So, what? Now my name's gonna be attached to this forever. Vanessa smirked. Depends. Do you want it to be? He frowned. What do you mean? I mean you have two choices. You can let this just be a moment, something that happened to you, something you eventually forget about. Or, she gestured to the phone, you can use it. Make people listen. Talk about it. Turn this into something bigger. Marcus sat back, staring at the screen. He had never really thought of himself as someone who wanted to make waves. He wasn't the type to post long rants online or try to be a spokesperson for anything. But at the same time, if what happened today could help someone else, then wasn't it worth sharing? He exhaled through his nose, then reached for his own phone. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for the world to change and start being part of the reason it did. The ripple effect. The next morning, Marcus woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop. At first, he thought it was just his alarm, but when he groggily reached for his phone and saw the flood of notifications lighting up his screen, he sat up fast. His heart pounded as he squinted at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. His post, the one he had made late last night after his conversation with his mom, had gone viral. It had started small. He had written a short but powerful summary of what happened at Summit Styles, explaining how Diane had accused him of stealing for no reason, how she had tried to humiliate him, and how she had folded the second she realized who his mother was. But instead of just venting his frustration, he had ended the post with a question. How many times has this happened to someone who didn't have a mother who could step in? How many kids have been kicked out of stores, humiliated, or worse, without anyone to defend them? And why does this keep happening? It had felt right when he posted it, raw, honest, and real. But he hadn't expected it to explode the way it did. Now thousands of people were commenting, sharing, and reacting. Some were outraged, calling out racial profiling in retail. Others shared similar stories, recounting times they had been followed in stores, accused without proof, or even banned from places simply because of the way they looked. Marcus scrolled through the comments, his stomach twisting with a mix of emotions. This happened to my little brother last month. He was just looking at a jacket, and the manager called security on him. They didn't even let him explain. I used to work retail, and I saw my boss target black kids all the time. I quit because I couldn't stand it. People like Diane don't learn. They just find another job and do the same thing somewhere else. Marcus exhaled sharply, setting his phone down for a moment. It was a lot to take in. He had always known things like this happened, but seeing so many people share their own experiences made it feel even bigger, like this wasn't just about him anymore. And maybe that was the point. A bigger spotlight. As Marcus was still processing everything, his bedroom door creaked open, and his mom stepped inside, holding her own phone in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. She raised an eyebrow at him. "So," she said, "are you aware that you're currently trending on 3 different social media platforms?" Marcus groaned, running a hand down his face. "I wasn't trying to go viral." Vanessa chuckled as she took a seat on the edge of his bed. "Well, it looks like you struck a nerve." She scrolled through her phone before glancing at him. "You even got a few reporters reaching out. They want to interview you." Marcus's stomach flipped. "What?" She handed him her phone so he could see for himself. Sure enough, there were messages from multiple journalists, all asking for statements or interviews. Some were from local news stations, but others were from bigger outlets, the kind with millions of readers. Marcus swallowed hard. I don't know if I want to do an interview." Vanessa studied him for a moment. "That's up to you," she said gently. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with." "But Marcus," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Right now, people are listening. And that doesn't happen often." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temple. "I get that, but what if I say the wrong thing? What if I just make things worse?" Vanessa tilted her head. "Do you believe what you wrote last night?" He looked up at her. "Of course I do." "Then you have nothing to worry about," she said simply. "Just speak your truth." Marcus leaned back against the headboard, staring at the messages again. He had always hated the idea of being in the spotlight. He wasn't the type to seek attention. But this wasn't about being famous. This was about making a difference. Maybe it was time to stop doubting himself. The interview. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat on the couch, his laptop open in front of him as he prepared for a virtual interview with a major news website. His palms were sweaty, and he could feel his nerves threatening to take over, but his mom sat beside him, radiating calm confidence. "Just breathe," she reminded him. "You're not performing. Just be you." Marcus nodded, swallowing hard as the video call connected. The interviewer, a polished woman in a blazer, smiled warmly through the screen. "Marcus, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today." Yeah," Marcus said, shifting slightly. "Thanks for having me." She nodded. "Let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened at Summit Styles?" Marcus took a deep breath. And then he told her everything. He described how excited he had been to buy his sneakers, how he had saved up for months, how Diane had zeroed in on him the moment he walked through the door. He spoke about the humiliation of being accused without proof, the way people had stood by in silence, and how his mother's intervention had flipped the script. The interviewer listened carefully, nodding along. When he finished, she leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, you wrote something really powerful in your post. You asked how many times this has happened to someone who didn't have someone to defend them. What do you think needs to change?" Marcus exhaled, gripping his hands together. "I think people need to start holding businesses accountable," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just about firing one person. It's about making sure places like Summit Styles actually train their employees to stop treating people like suspects just because of how they look. Because if nobody speaks up, then nothing changes." The interviewer nodded. "Do you think speaking up made a difference in this case?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I mean, Diane got fired. That's something. But I also think this is bigger than just one store. This is about how people are treated everywhere." The interviewer smiled. "Well said, Marcus. Thank you for sharing your story with us." As the call ended, Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to his mom, waiting for her reaction. She was beaming. "You did good, baby," she said softly. "Real good." Marcus exhaled, leaning back against the couch. He had no idea what would happen next. Maybe things would blow over in a few days. Maybe the conversation would keep growing. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about sneakers anymore. This was about something bigger. And for the first time, Marcus was ready to be a part of it. A new path forward. The next few days passed in a whirlwind. Marcus had never experienced anything like this before. One moment he was just a regular teenager trying to buy a pair of sneakers, and now his face was all over the internet. His post continued to spread. Interviews kept rolling in, and suddenly people he had never met were messaging him, telling him how much they related to his experience. Some people were praising him for speaking out. Others were angry, some because they felt seen for the first time, and others because they didn't want to acknowledge that this kind of thing still happened. It was overwhelming, but his mom had been right. People were listening. And for the first time, Marcus realized he had a voice worth hearing. One afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table scrolling through the latest updates, his mom walked in, setting down her laptop with a thoughtful expression. "Marcus," she said, "I think it's time we talk about next steps." Marcus looked up. "Next steps?" Vanessa nodded, leaning on the counter. "You've started something important, whether you meant to or not. This isn't just a one-time thing. The way people have responded shows that they want this conversation to keep going. But the question is, what do you want to do with it?" Marcus frowned, setting his phone down. He hadn't really thought about that. He had spoken up because it was the right thing to do. But now he was realizing that he had power. He had a platform, a chance to actually make an impact. He tapped his fingers against the table. I want to do something," he admitted. "But I don't know what. It's not like I have all the answers." "You don't have to," Vanessa said simply. "You just have to be willing to ask the right questions." Marcus exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "So, what? I keep posting about this stuff. Keep calling people out." Vanessa smiled. "That's one option, but there are other ways to create change too. Real, lasting change." She sat across from him, folding her hands. "For example, what if we push for actual policy changes in stores like Summit Styles? We could advocate for bias training for employees. We could work with organizations that are already fighting against discrimination in retail. There are a lot of ways to make sure this isn't just another story that people forget about next week." Marcus blinked, taking that in. He had been so focused on what had already happened that he hadn't even considered what could come next. "So, you're saying, we could turn this into something bigger?" Vanessa nodded. "Exactly. But it has to come from you, Marcus. People aren't just following the story. They are following you. They're waiting to see what you do next." Marcus sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. The thought was daunting. He wasn't some activist. He wasn't a politician. He was just a 16-year-old kid who wanted his sneakers. But at the same time, what if this had been someone else? What if it had been a kid without a mom who could step in? Without a platform to speak up? Without the confidence to challenge someone like Diane? Wouldn't he want someone to fight for them? Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's do it." Vanessa smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "Good, because I've already made a few calls." The meeting that changed everything. A few days later, Marcus found himself standing outside the corporate headquarters of Summit Styles, his stomach twisting into knots. He adjusted the sleeves of his hoodie, his nerves creeping up his spine. This was way outside of his comfort zone. His mom stood beside him, her confidence unwavering as always. "You ready?" Marcus swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah." They stepped inside, the sleek modern lobby buzzing with energy. Employees bustled past, some glancing at Marcus with recognition. By now, nearly everyone in the company had heard what had happened at the store. They had seen the viral posts, watched the interviews, and heard about how one teenager had taken down their manager with nothing but the truth. And now, the higher-ups wanted to talk. They were led into a large conference room, where several executives were already waiting. A tall man in a navy suit stood as they entered, extending his hand. "Mrs. Taylor, Marcus, thank you for coming in today," he said smoothly. "I'm Ryan Caldwell, Chief Operations Officer of Summit Styles." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Caldwell. The name rang a bell. He glanced at his mom, who subtly raised an eyebrow, as if she had noticed it too. Ryan gestured for them to sit, and once they did, he leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "First of all, I want to personally apologize for what happened to you, Marcus," he said. "What Diane did was completely unacceptable. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form, and we're taking this matter very seriously." Marcus didn't say anything right away. He was watching Ryan, studying his body language. The apology sounded good, but Marcus had seen enough interviews in the past few days to know that words meant nothing without action. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Marcus finally asked. Ryan nodded, as if he had expected that question. "Effective immediately, we're implementing new policies to prevent situations like this from happening again. All store managers and employees will undergo mandatory bias training, and we're establishing a direct complaint system for customers who feel they've been unfairly targeted. We're also offering you a position on our customer advisory panel, where you can help us improve our policies from the inside." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You want me to work with you guys?" Ryan smiled. "Who better to help us understand the problem than someone who's experienced it firsthand?" Marcus glanced at his mom, who gave him a slight nod. He turned back to Ryan. "That's a start," he admitted. "But it's not just about Summit Styles. This happens everywhere. So if we do this, I don't just want to help fix your company. I want to help fix the industry." Ryan's eyes flickered with surprise, but then he smiled. "I like the way you think, Marcus." Marcus exhaled. He hadn't even planned on saying that. It had just come out, but now that it was in the air, he realized how right it felt. He wasn't just here for himself anymore. He was here for every kid who had ever been humiliated the way he had. For every person who had been followed, accused, treated like they didn't belong. And maybe, just maybe, he could do something about it. The beginning of something new. As Marcus and Vanessa walked out of the headquarters, the cool afternoon breeze hit them, fresh and crisp. His mother glanced at him, a knowing smile on her lips. "So, how does it feel?" Marcus stuffed his hands in his pockets, thinking for a moment. Then he smirked. "Feels like this started with sneakers," he said, "but it's turning into something way bigger." Vanessa chuckled. "That's how change happens, one step at a time." Marcus nodded, and for the first time in days, he felt lighter. This wasn't just a story that was going to fade away. This was the beginning of something much, much bigger. And he was ready for it.